September 7th, 1931. New York City. The summer heat still clung to the sidewalks of Manhattan. Neon lights flickered along Broadway. Taxi horns echoed between tall buildings. The city looked alive, restless and loud. But behind the noise, something had gone very wrong. 5 men had disappeared. Not small-time criminals. Not street thugs. These were some of the most powerful gangsters in America. By morning, the whispers had already begun moving through speakeasies, social clubs, and backroom gambling parlors. 5 mob bosses had vanished, and no one was talking. No bodies were found. No witnesses stepped forward. No police reports explained what happened. But inside the American Mafia, everyone understood exactly why those men were gone. Because the old order of organized crime had just been erased. And the man behind all was a quiet, calculating Sicilian named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. For most of the 1920s, the American Mafia was controlled by one man, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria. Masuria was the head of what later became known as the Genovese crime family. But at the time, the organization was simply called the Family, and Masuria ruled it like a king. He believed the Mafia should remain exactly as it had been in Sicily. Old traditions, old loyalties, old rules. Masuria trusted only men born in Italy. Sicilian blood mattered more than anything else. But the streets of New York were changing. A new generation of gangsters had risen during Prohibition. They were younger, smarter, more business-minded. They worked with Irish gangsters, Jewish bootleggers, anyone who could make money. And at the center of this new generation stood Lucky Luciano. Luciano had grown up in the rough immigrant neighborhoods of Manhattan's Lower East Side. As a teenager, he ran protection rackets on Jewish kids walking to school. One of those kids refused to pay. His name was Meyer Lansky. Instead of fighting, the two became partners. That friendship would eventually reshape organized crime in America. By the late 1920s, Luciano had built powerful alliances with Lansky and another rising figure, Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel. Together they controlled bootlegging operations, gambling networks, and narcotics routes that stretched across the city. But there was a problem. The old bosses still ruled everything, and they hated the new generation. In 1930, the tension exploded into violence. Historians would later call it the Castellammarese War. It was one of the bloodiest power struggles in American Mafia history. On one side stood Joe Masuria, the established boss of bosses. On the other side was a rival Sicilian power broker, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had arrived in America from Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily. He brought with him a loyal group of Sicilian gangsters who believed they had the right to control New York. For nearly 2 years, the streets became a battlefield. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, bombings. Gangsters were killed in barbershops, restaurants, and outside apartment buildings. Dozens of mob soldiers died. And in the middle of the chaos, Lucky Luciano watched carefully. Luciano had started the war fighting for Masuria. But privately, he was beginning to understand something. The war was bad for business. Bootlegging profits were shrinking. Police attention was increasing. Too many valuable men were dying. Luciano believed the Mafia needed something different. A system, an organized structure that would allow different crime families to work together instead of killing each other. But there was one problem. As long as Masuria and Maranzano were alive, that future could never exist. April 15th, 1931. Coney Island, Brooklyn. The afternoon sun hung low over the ocean. The famous Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant sat quietly near the boardwalk. Inside, Lucky Luciano was sitting at a table with Joe Masuria. They were playing cards. Luciano looked relaxed, calm. Masuria trusted him completely. Luciano had spent years serving as one of Masuria's most loyal lieutenants. Lunch arrived. Wine glasses were filled, and the card game continued. Then Luciano stood up. He told Masuria he needed to use the restroom. Masuria nodded and kept shuffling the cards. A moment later, the restaurant doors opened. 4 men walked inside. Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, all rising gangsters loyal to Luciano. They walked directly toward the table. Masuria looked up. Too late. Gunshots exploded through the restaurant. When the shooting stopped, Joe Masuria lay slumped in his chair, dead. The war had just changed direction. With Masuria gone, Salvatore Maranzano became the most powerful mafia leader in New York. Maranzano declared himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized New York's criminal underworld into 5 families, each with its own leadership. The structure looked modern, but Maranzano himself remained old-fashioned. He demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, and he began quietly studying Lucky Luciano. Luciano had become too powerful, too influential with the younger gangsters. Maranzano started planning something. He wanted Luciano eliminated, but Luciano had his own network of informants. One day, a warning reached him. "He's planning to kill you." Maranzano had ordered the hit, and suddenly Luciano realized something chilling. The war wasn't over. It had simply changed targets. September 10th, 1931. Maranzano had scheduled a meeting in his office at 2:30 Park Avenue in Manhattan. Luciano was expected to attend, but Luciano never showed up. Instead, 4 men entered the office. They wore suits. They carried briefcases. To the building staff, they looked like government agents. The men flashed fake FBI badges and told Maranzano's guards they needed to question him. The guards stepped aside. Inside the office, Maranzano was caught completely off guard. The men pulled knives and guns. The attack was brutal and fast. When it ended, Salvatore Maranzano was dead on his office floor. The boss of bosses had ruled for less than 6 months. But that night, the violence didn't stop. Across New York and parts of New Jersey, several other powerful mob leaders disappeared. Men loyal to the old Sicilian order. Men who might challenge Luciano's new system. Gangsters like Joseph, Joe the Baker, Catania, and several other Castellamarese loyalists were suddenly gone. No bodies, no public executions, just silence. Within hours, the entire power structure of the Mafia had changed. 5 influential mobsters had vanished into the night, and a new order was quietly taking control. For the first time in American history, the Mafia would no longer be ruled by a single boss. It would be run like a corporation, and Lucky Luciano was about to build the system that still shapes organized crime today. But before that system could rise, more blood still had to disappear. September 1931, New York City. The killings stopped almost as suddenly as they had begun. For months, gunfire had echoed through Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Newspapers had reported bodies found in alleyways, in parked cars, and on quiet residential streets. Then silence. The Castellamarese War was over. Joe Masuria was dead. Salvatore Maranzano was dead. And the older generation of Sicilian bosses who supported them had either vanished, fled, or quietly accepted defeat. For the public, the violence simply faded into rumor. But inside the underworld, everyone understood what had happened. A new leadership had taken control, and at the center of it all stood Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was only 33 years old, but by the fall of 1931, he had already become one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. Unlike the bosses who came before him, Luciano did not believe in ruling through fear alone. He believed in structure, efficiency, profit. He looked at organized crime not as a collection of gangs, but as a business. The old Sicilian system had created endless wars. Bosses fought over territory. Personal grudges turned into assassinations. Money was lost. Attention from law enforcement increased. Luciano believed the Mafia needed something different, a governing system. So within weeks of Maranzano's death, Luciano began arranging a series of quiet meetings across New York City. The locations changed constantly. Back rooms of Italian restaurants, private apartments, offices hidden inside legitimate businesses. Only the most powerful figures in organized crime were invited. Among them were men who would become legends of the American underworld. Vito Genovese, a ruthless Sicilian gangster who had helped carry out the assassination of Joe Masuria. Frank Costello, Luciano's trusted advisor, known for his calm intelligence and political connections. Albert Anastasia, a violent enforcer with a reputation for brutality, already feared throughout the docks of Brooklyn. And Luciano's closest non-Italian ally, Meyer Lansky. Lansky was not Sicilian. He was not even Italian, but he was one of the sharpest financial minds in organized crime. Together, these men were about to redesign the entire structure of the Mafia. The meeting that changed everything took place later that year. Historians believe it happened somewhere in New York, possibly in a quiet hotel conference room or private estate outside the city. The exact location was never confirmed, but the outcome became legendary. Luciano proposed eliminating the title of Capo di Tutti Capi forever. No more boss of all bosses. That system had caused nothing but war. Instead, Luciano suggested something radical. A commission, a governing council made up of the leaders of the major crime families. Each boss would control his own territory, but major decisions, especially murders of high-ranking members, would require approval from the commission. It was, in many ways, a criminal version of a corporate board. The proposal shocked some of the older mob figures. For generations, the Mafia had operated on rigid traditions. But Luciano's argument was simple. War was bad for business. Cooperation meant profit. Eventually, the room agreed. And just like that, the modern American Mafia Commission was born. New York City was divided into 5 permanent families, each with its own boss, soldiers, and criminal operations. The structure would remain almost unchanged for decades. The families that emerged from that moment were the Luciano family, later known as the Genovese crime family, the Mangano family, which would later become the Gambino crime family, the Gagliano family, later known as the Lucchese crime family, the Prophesai family, which would become the Colombo crime family, and the Bonanno crime family, led by Joseph Bonanno. Beyond New York, other powerful organizations were also included in the commission. One of the most important was the Chicago outfit, led by the feared and calculating Al Capone. The commission created a balance of power that had never existed before. It allowed organized crime to expand across the country while keeping internal violence under control, at least in theory. But the creation of this new system came with a price. Luciano knew that some powerful gangsters would never accept the new order. Many of them were loyal to the old Sicilian traditions. Some were still loyal to Maranzano. Others simply feared Luciano's growing influence. If these men stayed alive, they could start another war. Luciano decided to eliminate the threat before it could grow. What followed became known among Mafia historians as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Though the exact details remain debated, several high-ranking Castellammarese loyalists disappeared around the same time Maranzano was killed. These men were seen as potential rivals to Luciano's authority. Among them were figures connected to Maranzano's faction who had survived the war. Within days, they were gone. No trials, no negotiations, just disappearance. The message was clear. The old guard had been erased. By the end of 1931, Lucky Luciano had achieved something no gangster before him had ever done. He had unified the American Mafia. For the next several years, organized crime flourished under the new structure. Bootlegging continued to bring enormous profits until the end of Prohibition in 1933. Afterward, the families expanded into new rackets. Illegal gambling operations, labor union control, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, construction rackets, and the Mafia began infiltrating legitimate businesses across the country. Nightclubs, garment factories, shipping docks. Politicians were bribed. Police officers were paid to look the other way. For a time, Luciano's system appeared unstoppable, but the very structure Luciano created also made the Mafia easier to track. The FBI had been watching organized crime for years, but during the early 1930s, the Bureau still focused primarily on bank robbers and kidnappers. The Mafia remained mostly invisible. That would soon change, because another man had begun paying close attention to Lucky Luciano, a relentless New York prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, ambitious, and determined to bring down the most powerful criminal organization in America. Unlike previous investigators, Dewey understood something important. Luciano was not just a gangster. He was the architect of an entire criminal empire, and if Dewey could destroy Luciano, the entire structure might collapse. For the moment, however, Luciano remained untouchable. He lived in luxury apartments, drove expensive cars, attended high-end nightclubs with movie stars and politicians. To the public, he looked like a wealthy businessman. But behind closed doors, the commission quietly governed the underworld. Murders required approval. Territories were negotiated. Profits were shared. For the first time, the American Mafia operated like a national syndicate. The violence of the Castellammarese War had faded into memory, and for several years, the system worked. But every empire eventually attracts attention. And as Lucky Luciano's power grew, so did the number of enemies waiting for the right moment to strike. The next attack would not come from rival gangsters. It would come from the law, and it would threaten to destroy everything Luciano had built. New York City. The American Mafia had never been stronger. Across the city, the five families quietly controlled vast sections of the underground economy. Dock workers paid tribute. Bookmakers operated in every borough. Construction contracts quietly flowed through mob-controlled unions. And above it all, the commission kept the peace. The system Lucky Luciano designed was working exactly as intended. Violence had decreased. Profits had skyrocketed. For several years, Luciano lived like a king. But the man studying his empire had not forgotten. His name was Thomas E. Dewey, and he was preparing a case that would shake the entire underworld. Dewey had recently been appointed special prosecutor for New York County. He was methodical, patient, and unlike many investigators before him, he understood how organized crime actually worked. Luciano rarely touched illegal money directly. He rarely appeared at crime scenes. He surrounded himself with layers of lieutenants, soldiers, and associates. The structure Luciano had created protected him. But Dewey had another strategy. Instead of chasing murders or bootlegging operations, he began investigating a network of prostitution rings operating across New York. It seemed like a minor crime, but Dewey believed the operation was far larger than anyone suspected. His investigators began interviewing dozens of women working in brothels and call houses across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The brothels were not independent operations. They were connected. Money from each location flowed upward through managers, collectors, and intermediaries. And eventually, it reached one name: Lucky Luciano. At first, the evidence seemed thin. Luciano never appeared at the brothels. He never personally collected money. But Dewey's investigators kept digging. They followed financial trails, telephone records, witness testimony. Eventually, several women agreed to testify. They described a system where brothel owners paid weekly fees to mob collectors. Those collectors delivered cash to higher-ranking members of Luciano's organization. The prostitution network stretched across hundreds of locations. Some estimates suggested over 200 brothels operating under the same protection system. And every week, enormous amounts of money moved upward through the chain. For Dewey, it was enough. February 1st, 1936. Hot Springs, Arkansas. Luciano had traveled south to enjoy a quiet vacation. Hot Springs was famous for its casinos and luxury resorts. Gangsters from across the country visited the town regularly. Luciano believed he was far from danger. But that morning, police officers arrived at his hotel. He was placed under arrest and transported back to New York. The news exploded across national newspapers. Lucky Luciano arrested. For the first time, the most powerful mob boss in America was facing serious criminal charges. The trial began in May 1936. It immediately became one of the most sensational court cases in American history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers. Luciano sat calmly beside his attorneys, dressed in expensive suits, smoking cigarettes, watching the proceedings without visible emotion. But the prosecution had something powerful. Witnesses, dozens of women who described the prostitution network in disturbing detail. They spoke about pimps, collectors, and mob protection. Some of them directly identified Luciano as the man who controlled the operation. Luciano's defense team tried to attack their credibility. They argued the witnesses were criminals themselves. They accused Dewey of building a case on unreliable testimony. But the evidence kept piling up. Financial records, phone calls, connections between brothel owners and Luciano's associates. For weeks, the courtroom listened to story after story about the vast prostitution empire. And at the center of it, the same name kept appearing: Lucky Luciano. June 7th, 1936. After hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict: guilty. Luciano was convicted on multiple counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence shocked even experienced observers: 30 to 50 years in prison. For the most powerful mob boss in America, it was a devastating blow. Luciano was transported to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a massive prison near the Canadian border. The architect of the modern Mafia was now locked behind steel bars. But Luciano's influence did not disappear overnight. From inside prison, he continued communicating with members of the Commission. His closest ally, Frank Costello, began taking on more leadership responsibilities. Costello was calm, diplomatic, and politically connected. Unlike many mob bosses, he preferred negotiation over violence. Under Costello's guidance, the Luciano family continued operating smoothly. The Commission still met. The five families still governed New York's underworld. Luciano's system had become larger than any single man. Even its creator could not destroy it. Then came another unexpected chapter. World War II. American intelligence officials grew concerned about potential sabotage at the New York docks. The harbor was one of the most important shipping centers for the U.S. military. But the waterfront unions were heavily influenced by organized crime. Authorities believed the Mafia controlled many of the dock workers, and they needed that control. The U.S. Navy quietly approached an unlikely partner, Lucky Luciano. Through intermediaries, including Meyer Lansky, a deal was arranged. Luciano would help ensure security and cooperation among dock workers. In return, the government would consider reducing his sentence. The operation became known as Operation Underworld, and it worked. The docks remained secure. No major sabotage occurred. In 1946, after serving nearly 10 years in prison, Luciano received an unexpected decision. Governor Thomas E. Dewey, the same prosecutor who had convicted him, approved his release. But there was one condition. Luciano would be deported to Italy. He would never be allowed to return to the United States. The decision ended Luciano's physical presence in the American underworld, but not his legacy. January 26, 1962, Naples, Italy. Lucky Luciano was standing inside the Naples International Airport. He had come to meet a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Luciano had lived quietly in Italy for years, occasionally traveling and maintaining old connections. But that evening, something went wrong. Luciano suddenly collapsed. A heart attack. Within minutes, the man who built the modern Mafia was dead. He was 64 years old. Back in the United States, the system he created continued to operate. The five families still ruled New York. The Commission still mediated disputes. Gangsters like Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, and Joseph Bonanno would rise to power within the structure Luciano designed. For decades, law enforcement would struggle to dismantle the organization he built. Because Luciano had understood something fundamental. The Mafia could survive the death of any single boss, as long as the system remained intact. And that system began the night several powerful mobsters quietly vanished from New York. No witnesses, no bodies, just silence. A silence that marked the end of the old Mafia and the birth of a criminal empire that would shape organized crime for generations.